I think DC should be a state, and the reason for that is that there are 700,000 people in the District of Columbia in what we call, and what we're proud of, a democracy. The idea of democracy comes from the Greek word demos, which means the people. So the idea that there's 700,000 people here in the District of Columbia that don't have a voting member of Congress, that don't have senators, is kind of obnoxious to this idea that we have of democracy. So we need a federal district because the Constitution says there must be a federal district. It could be a lot smaller, and we could actually grant power to the 700,000 people in DC who are disenfranchised. By the way, this one I would extend to like the United States Senate, where the 40 million people of California have the same 2 senators as the 350,000 people of Wyoming. I think there's a lot of work we could do to get more true to this idea of democracy, people, and DC statehood would be a good step in that direction.
So for the last 150 years, every single state that's entered the Union passed one of 2 tests. It was either 10,000 square miles or they had 6 million people. Washington, D.C. fails both of those tests, and pretty dramatically. It's not 10,000 square miles, it's like 68 square miles. It's 95% smaller than Rhode Island. And so that just leads us to the point that it's not a state, it's a city. Now, it's a great city, and I agree with Jim. These people should be able to have full representation in Congress. We don't have to create a new state to get that done. We can do what we did before, which is we gave the parts of Washington, D.C. on the Virginia side back to Virginia. That allowed those people to have their United States senators representing them and the rest of Virginia. We could do that with the Maryland parts of the district too, and we should.
Yeah, to which I would just respond, it is a city. It doesn't have the geographical size, as Dusty says. It would be a very small state, but nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you need to have a certain geographical area or a certain number of people to be a state. And I think, again, if we get back to the core concept of democracy, Hong Kong, a democracy that used to be a democracy we worry about, it's a bunch of rocks in the Pacific, and yet none of us would say, oh, it's fine for it for the people of Hong Kong not to have representation. There's countries that are tiny, Monaco, etc. So the point is that I hear what Dusty's saying. There is precedent, and we should be respectful of precedent, but there is no particular rule in the Constitution that says that it's okay to effectively disenfranchise these people because there's not a lot of them gathered in one place. By the way, if we go to the route of saying we shouldn't have enfranchisement for small groups of people, look out Montana.
So again, no, but I certainly don't want to take away Montana's statehood, but you can have one of 2 tests. I mean, clearly managing a state is not just about people, it's also about roads, it's also about state parks, it's also about the kinds of things that managing a body of land requires. If it's about fairness, we're not going to give Cleveland to United States senators. We're not going to give Milwaukee to United States senators. We don't give cities senators. If this is really about fairness, we would be able to enfranchise the people of Washington, D.C. Through retrocession, like we did, giving the Virginia part back to Virginia. We should give the Maryland part back to Maryland. This is ultimately, I fear, about a power play. It really is about balancing the political, evenness of the Senate by trying to give Washington, D.C. 2 senators. And if statehood is all about a power play, I think that's a more difficult argument to get Americans united behind.
I think a couple of good issues have been highlighted, but I do feel very, very strongly that one of the problems we have in this country, frankly, is that we don't have enough democracy. I talked a little bit about the U.S. Senate. I understand where the U.S. Senate came from. In fact, it came from the Connecticut Compromise, so I'm proud of that compromise. However, I do believe that in a mature democracy, there's a lot you could do to make for a more democratic nation. For example, let's elect the president by a majority of Americans deciding who the president should be. That's not what we do today. We have an electoral college set up by a bunch of guys 240 years ago. We have a profoundly unrepresentative body in the United States Senate. In my view, we should look at those things where we have deeply undemocratic mechanisms that may have made sense 240 years ago when literacy in this country was 8%. Today we're a mature democracy with an educated populace. We ought to be moving in the direction of more democracy for the American people, including the people of the District of Columbia.
In general, the more diverse your organization, the more important it is, I think, to have mechanisms that are not just majoritarian. Half of Americans live in 9 United States states. And there are some who would argue then that 50% of all the senators in the U.S. Senate should come from just those 9 states. But again, when you're a diverse organization, a diverse country like the United States is, I think you need to be able to have some other mechanisms. Think about the United Nations. We don't give China 1,000 times the votes in the United Nations that we give Austria. We acknowledge that those voices have value, even if one country is a lot more populated than the other. The reason the Constitution established a voice for people in the House and a voice for states in the Senate is that they knew that that would give America the best chance to be successful from one end of the country to the other. I like the way we've got it today.